In this video, we will discuss the user profiles for the GBV and child protection modules of V4. The objectives of this video are for you to understand the difference between user profiles in the other modules of V4, such as registration or resettlement or RSD, and those in the child protection and GBV modules, as well as to provide an overview of the security model for the child protection and GBV modules, which is different than the rest of V4, and then to review the user profiles available for child protection and GBV users. This video should be watched in conjunction with the video on user management, as the user profiles, which will be described in this video, will then be explained how to apply them in the user management video. To start with, we'll look at the security model and the user profiles and the difference between those in the general V4 setup versus the specific modules for child protection and GBV. So in general, access to V4 is team-based and role-based. What this means is that you would be assigned access to modules based upon the team within which you work. So if I work within the registration team, I would have access to the registration module, or if I work in the RSD team, I would have registration to a bit of the registration module as well as the RSD module. In addition to that access to the general modules, then based upon what my position is, my role, and then the depth of information that I am able to access in those modules will be determined. This is a team-based access, which means that everybody who has access to the registration module will be able to see all of the cases within the registration model. The same is true for those in the resettlement or in the RSD. Now, the amount of information that is available would be determined by your role, and generic profiles are given for the different levels. So if you have level 1 access, meaning any positions that fall within level 1, you would be able to see the least amount of information, but you would be able to see that information in all of the files. Whereas if you had the highest level of access, then you would be able to see all of the information in all of those files within that module. So this is why we talk about team-based or role-based access for the general V4 modules. Now, if you do not have access to, or if you are just accessing V4 as someone who does not have access to the GBV or child protection module, then there are still some ways that GBV and child protection is visible outside of the GBV and child protection modules. We've tried to limit it to ensure that we maintain need to know, but the GBV and child protection SPN, if used, and in most cases we do not recommend this, would be visible, but only to the highest level of access to the SPN module or entity. So this would not be to all users. As we just talked about the role-based, there are a very limited number of users that would be able to use this. And this is important because we should not be using the SPNs for searching for vulnerability criteria. This really, especially for GBV, this is not the purpose of that. So that's why we don't encourage the usage of that as an SPN in general. Additionally, beyond the SPN, cases are not visible unless the individual has access privileges to the module and the case. Thus, if you are a user of the registration module or a registration officer and you don't have access to the GBV or child protection module, if you were to click on a case for an individual who has a GBV case, you would not see anything linked to that case that would indicate GBV or child protection unless you both had access to the GBV module or child protection module and you also had access to that individual case. So really the visibility of GBV and child protection cases are not visible outside of the GBV and child protection modules. Additionally, if you were to send a referral to the GBV team, or if a referral was to be sent from the GBV or child protection team, these referrals are protected to only be seen by the sender and the receiver. So those who need to receive the referral and to act upon it will be able to see it and to be able to follow up on it, and that it would not be visible in the referral audit log to all users of ProGres. Now, there is an asterisk by this because it's important to note that in most units, it is team-based. So if the referrals are sent to a team, then anybody who has access to that referral function would be able to see that referral within the team. Now, as we've mentioned, this is very different than the security for the GBV and child protection modules. We had to build ours based upon the need to know principle, which does not allow for team access. So we can't allow for everybody within a location to have access to all of the files. And so instead of team-based, individuals are granted access to the GBV or child protection module specific to their role. So depending upon what their specific need is to access or to engage with the module, if it's to document their case management or if it's to generate reports, their access would be granted specifically based upon that. And then within the module, not everyone has access to every single case. It is owner-based access, meaning the individuals responsible for the case management are the only ones who have access to their cases. So if I am a caseworker working on a case, I am the owner of that case and I am the only one who can then see that case. Now, specific to the child protection and GBV modules, and we will discuss this in more detail, these modules can be configured to allow for supervision, meaning that if I was that caseworker, my supervisor could be able to see my cases to supervise my work and to help give me feedback on that. And that is unique as well to the GBV and child protection modules. On this slide, we will review the different types of user profiles that are available for child protection and GBV. Those indicated in blue, or the text indicated in blue, are changes that have been made with the most recent development for these two modules. The first one on the left is the protection case reader. This is not intended for specifically GBV or child protection actors. It's actually a role intended for those who are most frequently faced with disclosures or individuals who are following up on the status of their cases. And this would allow for a very limited amount of visibility for the individual to know that a case exists. As we mentioned in the last slide, the visibility of GBV and child protection cases are intentionally not visible outside of access to this module. Thus, it is difficult when someone might present to a protection desk for the individual who is working with them to know that a GBV or child protection case exists. If this role is applied to this individual, they would then be able to see when looking up the person who has come to follow up on the case that a case does exist and who that caseworker is. That is the only information that is available to someone with this role, and it would allow for them then to create a referral or follow up or contact the caseworker so that then they can continue and support and follow up on this case. The next role is the child protection or GBV case reader. This is as well not intended for GBV or child protection specialists or direct service providers. This is more for those who might have to engage with a case periodically from time to time upon request. It does not allow them to make any modifications to a case or really even access a case with, like in general, they can't just log into the GBV or child protection module and see cases. But what it would allow is in those specific contexts where an individual would need to be granted access to a case. For example, perhaps at the stages of assessment for resettlement, the caseworker in a child protection or GBV case could then grant access to a specific part of a case and share that with someone who has a case reader access. This could also be for a senior level protection officer who does not get engaged in many cases, so they don't need a full caseworker profile, but periodically they need to be engaged like one of the most complex cases. And then in this case, if they had a case reader profile or part of the case could be shared with them so that they could be able to access the basic information and then take the action that's being requested of them. The caseworker is really the foundation of this module, of these two modules, and this is intended for those who work directly on these cases. So the caseworker would be responsible for then creating the case, for those that they are doing the documentation, and then for any documentation related to that case management. Now, for a UNHCR caseworker, this could be limited to creating a case and then referring it to a partner organization, or in those contexts where we're doing direct service provision, they could be using all of the entities in the GBV or child protection module to document the full spectrum from case opening to case closure. A caseworker is the owner of the case, meaning that they can see all of the information and documentation within that case. They also have the ability to share that case for the specific needs. They have the ability to read and to write. They can create new entities, they can change, they can make modifications upon that case file. The case manager is a similar profile. They have all of the functionality of a caseworker. So if they were to create a case and they were then to be providing case management to an individual, they would be able to make the necessary changes and they would be the owner of that case. But in addition to that caseworker functionality within this, a case manager has the ability to then also see the cases of those caseworkers that they supervise. So this allows them to provide any additional notes, follow-up recommendations, basically to provide feedback and to oversee the casework of the caseworker and to provide any sign-off depending upon the process that is necessary in the case management process. They have the ability to read and to write on both their cases as well as the caseworker they supervise cases. The next one is a monitor, and there are actually 3 different types of monitors, but the intention of this role is to allow for individuals to not have access to all of the personal data within a case file. So we're trying to, again, maintain the need to know principles. So all personal data is not visible, as well as any of the information that is in type-in boxes. The information that is visible to a monitor are those that are related to drop-down boxes. So the person who would tend to be assigned a monitor role would be those who are responsible for generating reports and for assuring data quality, so that they would be able to identify if there are any errors in the data or anything that, and follow up with caseworkers for them to be able to change it. It's important to note that a monitor is not able to change or write on any files, so that they can only identify errors, but they would have to follow up with the caseworker to allow for anything to be corrected if there are errors found in the data. It's important to note with the monitor that there are 3 different versions of this available. So there is a monitor who can see all of the information in the module. There is a monitor who can only see the information entered into the module by UNHCR staff. And then there is a monitor who can only see the information entered into the module for a specific partner. And this is intended to allow for flexibility so that depending upon in negotiations with partners, partners can be responsible for their own monitoring and don't have to allow access for UNHCR staff to be able to see all of their files. And this is an important option to allow for the flexibility for the module to be best implemented in line with need to know principle and best practice. And the final position is called a super user. This is meant to be an administrative position and is actually optional and not necessary in all contexts. But the purpose of it is because of the security module in child protection and GBV, you can have individual cases that are owned by a caseworker or a case manager. And if that individual was to leave a context and did not transfer those cases, then it's possible that nobody has access to those cases. And in that case, we would need somebody who would be able to transfer the case to another caseworker so that it is accessible and can be followed up. And this is the purpose of the super user. Now, the reason we say this is optional is because the super user really serves no other purpose beyond this. They can't write on the cases. They're not going to be using this as to follow up. And new security has been put into place, which prevents individuals from transferring from one location to another without transferring their case files. If all case files must be transferred in advance of departure from a location, then the purpose of the super user is really less necessary. And so we have find more and more that the need for a super user is not really justified in a lot of contexts. So this is something to be considered in terms of when you're determining assigning these positions. One core concept that I hadn't mentioned previously is around business units. So the data in V4 is divided into business units. It's how we organize the files. So sometimes you'll have within a country, you'll have one country has one business unit, or as in, for example, here, you'll see that there's a business unit for Zatari or Amman and Jordan. So each of the different areas has their own business unit. So that access that we just spoke to in terms of general V4 does not apply to all of the information across all of the modules. It would be specific to that business unit. So I might have access to the registration module, and I would have to be assigned that for the access to the registration module in Zatari business unit. If I would need access to both the data in Zatari and Amman because of my position, then I would need to assign a role, a user profile for registration level 1 for Zatari, registration level 1 for Amman. The same thing is true for the GBV module. Well, you would never be granted access to all of the case files for a GBV or child protection module. If I want to be able to access the GBV module for my work as a caseworker in Zatari or Amman, I would need to then have a user profile that would be access to the GBV module in Zatari and the GBV module in Amman, let's say as a monitor, so that I can then do the quality assurance for my case files in both of those business units. So it is quite possible to require a user profile in multiple BUs so that you have the access as necessary. As we mentioned previously, in the GBV and child protection modules, there is the ability to identify supervisors as well as then to allow them access not only to their own cases, but then to those that they are supervising. This is important in these modules as there is case-by-case access. So we need to allow for case management supervision to take place. And so this is something called positions, and it's a hierarchy function, meaning that it places people depending upon their roles and their relationship to others in their unit. So this means that for each user, you need to define not only what their role is, but also what their location is. So the system can place them in their position and in their location. So this is what creates a position. So for this picture, you'll notice that we're in the Nairobi office, and there's a case manager and caseworker 1 and caseworker 2. So when we create someone's position, we would not just say case manager, but we would need to know this is the case manager in Nairobi, or this is a caseworker in Nairobi. And this would then allow us to then place them in the hierarchy, which would then allow for the appropriate access to the case files and their appropriate relationship to the other user profiles assigned. So an example of what this can look like in terms of these positions, this is a business unit. And so in terms of access, a super user, a protection case reader, and a monitor, none of these are positional. These don't depend upon the individual access. These do not depend upon your role within a supervision or supervisee. These are more like the general V4 roles, which is allowing you to have access to all of the cases to different degrees within that business unit. Now, within this, we have, because that can be sometimes an issue for our partners, and it should be implemented differently depending upon our specific role within the case management. We can also have as we said, roles that just are specific to, we can create units within, so UNHCR and partner units that allow for then a more need to know access to the individual files. So what we have usually in terms of a layout for the child protection or the GBV modules is that you would have assigned caseworkers who would be UNHCR staff, who would then report to a case manager who would be their supervisor. So each of these caseworkers would be able to see their own individual case files, and their case manager would be able to create their own files as well, but also be able to see the caseworkers they supervise so that they can provide feedback. A GBV case reader does not have access to any file, so they could log into the GBV module and they would see nothing. But if they were to be engaged in a specific case, let's say, for example, for resettlement, and they needed to have access to a basic piece of that case file, then the caseworker who is responsible for that case would then be able to share that part of the case file, and then this individual and the case reader would then be able to access that piece of the case file. A UNHCR only monitor would be able to then go and see all of the cases in this business unit, in this module, to do quality assurance and to generate reports. Similarly, if a partner was to be using one of these modules, the partner can have the same way a caseworker who would then be responsible for all of the documentation of the cases they're responsible for, a case manager who is then able to see their cases as well as the caseworker, and then they also have a different role called a partner supervisor, who basically it allows for 3 levels of visibility, so that this partner supervisor would be able to see the cases of the case manager as well as those that the case manager supervises. A partner monitor would allow for the partner monitor to be able to see, again, similar to our UNHCR monitor or the other monitor, only the drop-down menu-based data for the GBV or child protection module to allow for quality assurance. So if the partner would like to do their own QA, quality assurance, then you would assign a UNHCR only monitor for our team and a partner monitor for their team, and then that would allow to ensure that all of the data within the business unit for these modules would be quality assured. Okay, so now we will discuss a concept called service units. So while the GBV and child protection modules have been designed to allow for case-by-case access, and this is how in most contexts they should be applied, we have found that there are exceptions to this rule for specific needs. And within those contexts, it can be useful to assign something called a service unit. And what a service unit is it groups together particular caseworkers and or case managers, and it would allow the cases are owned by or shared with a service unit, that they're available to everyone in that service unit. Again, this undermines a bit the security model that we have designed. So this should not be the general approach to user profiles in the GBV and child protection modules. This would be for very specific purposes. So as I said, this is not advisable for wide use as it affects the performance of the system. But what those specific purposes can be are when archiving old cases, so that you have only old cases that are not being in active use, but that then possibly would be available in the case that someone was to come back years later or in the future. Additionally, cases in particular locations that need to be accessed by different caseworkers. What this would oftentimes look like is if you were in like a 24-hour facility where there are shifts, it's possible that you would then have, and the individual caseworkers are never on at the same time. So you never know if someone will show up at the other time. So you would then, having a service unit for those individuals might make sense. So they can deal with those cases in a more ad hoc fashion that would be common in those types of scenarios. This would be common in perhaps a detention center or in a residential center where different personnel may be conducting that monitoring. And finally, broker case management files. And what we mean by that is in the situation where the individuals are not actually doing case management or the full case management, where they tend to be just referring files for actual case management. So we're not talking about having like descriptions of the incidents and this sort of stuff. We're talking about the existence of the files and that there has been a referral to a partner or that sort of thing. And in that situation, it also might make sense so that the other caseworkers are aware of the existence of the case, but don't have any of the personal information that would then really violate the need to know principle and the purpose for the individual ownership of those modules. So as we said, there are specific situations where implementing service units is appropriate. The vast majority of situations, it is not the method which we would recommend. Okay, so what this would look like in practice is here you'll see we have a similar organogram to that we saw in a previous slide. Currently, in the setup as it is, you will see that caseworkers have the ability to share cases between them. So if I was a caseworker and I was going on leave, I could share those cases I knew were being followed up this week with the other caseworker so that they would be able to fill in with the consent of the survivor or with the child for those cases. If I was a caseworker who was leaving my post and going to another position, I could then, with the consent of the survivor or the child, transfer that case to one of the other caseworkers or to my supervisor so that they could then continue on with that case management. If I was a partner who was then ending our partnership and there was no other partner to share the files with or to transfer them to, then we could also, in agreement that would be made as part of the finalization of the partnership, transfer the files from the partner caseworkers to then the UNHCR caseworkers to do the follow-up and necessary case management until a new partnership would be established. So that is how this would work in terms of the normal setup. If there were to be UNHCR or partner service units established, so let's say that this is the picture of a group who works at a 24-hour facility, and there are two caseworkers who alternate times, and we had a service unit here. This service unit has the ability to refer or transfer from the service unit to the partner supervisor, who would then be able to designate who within the partner would be able to access it, or if the partner service unit had, let's say for one location, a service unit, that they could then refer that or send that to, let's say, the case manager in this location, who would then assign this to a caseworker. So that would be how a service unit would apply within a UNHCR or with a partner. And this, again, would be specified by this. You would have to identify the specific caseworkers and case manager, if that applies, that the service unit would apply within. So as we've seen across this, it is important, it's probably the most important point in this video, usage and assigned user profile should only be determined by someone's role in case management. There should be no access to the GBV or child protection cases in V4 for the purposes of partner monitoring or for just viewing case files. You should only be accessing a case file for a specific case management purpose, not for GBV data or trends analysis. You should only use what you need to document for service provision. So your role should be assigned based upon that. There shouldn't be any assigned for just so that you can have all access to the information. It should only be for that information that you need to be able to perform your duty. We have spent a lot of time expanding the number of profiles to allow for flexibility in the configuration of these. Thus, it's really important, especially if you are looking to implement V4 with a partner, that the designation and the assignment of profiles is something that should be negotiated with partners. The use of super user, the use of monitors are not mandatory, and they should be determined in a joint negotiation, as well as the usage of service units or any other access to case files. And finally, it's really important that UNHCR staff, GBV and child protection, as well as beyond that, are well trained on not only V4 and how to use it, but these user profiles so that you can clearly explain to your team, as well as to your senior management, as well as to partners, kind of what are the different functionalities and usages of these roles, and that they're appropriately applied. This is key to having the information that you need and are supposed to access, and preventing unnecessary access to sensitive GBV and child protection information. For more information on how to apply these user profiles, please see the next video on user management.